So we were looking at various radiation processes, which would be of importance in pulsar magnetosphere, and I had just started this, and there is more to come. So in this lecture, we'll try to finish it. Okay. So this is where we were in the last lecture. We talked about synchrotron radiation and various characteristic energies and frequencies of synchrotron radiation, the power of synchrotron radiation, and the synchrotron lifetime. And this is important for pulsar magnetosphere because if you release a high energy electron at some angle with respect to the magnetic field, then what this shows you is that it will very quickly radiate away all the energy which is perpendicular to the magnetic field and come down to the lowest lambda level with momentum only parallel to the magnetic field. And once you have created these high energy photons in the magnetosphere, they can then go on to do pair production, and then pair production can then lead to further emission, and then further pair production leading to a cascade. And the photon optical depth is such that it needs to travel a distance of this magnitude to create a pair, as long as the energy of the photon is larger than the threshold for pair creation. And as I said, that although this coefficient looks small, it's because you have to build up enough perpendicular component of the magnetic field. It needs, the photon needs to travel quite a long distance for pair production to happen, unless the radius of curvature of the magnetic field is small, and that is why people invoke, at least close to the surface, they invoke multipolar magnetic fields. So now let's go on from the synchrotron to some basic results of relativistic transformations, because what we'll be talking about is particles radiating in some frame, but this whole radiating frame has a large bulk velocity with respect to us. So it is important to keep in mind the relativistic transformations that will operate between the instantaneous rest frame of the radiator and the observer, which is basically us. So some of the key results are, if you take the total power emitted, so I can compute this total power emitted in the instantaneous rest frame of the particle. And if you now go to another frame where you compute the total power radiated, but this is the total power radiated integrated over all subbands. So basically the isotropic integral of the power emitted, that is the same. So the particle radiates certain n ergs per second in its rest frame. It doesn't matter if you go to a moving frame and enclose the particle and look at the entire radiation crossing this. It is frame independent. So you will not have.
So it comes directly from the power expression that you showed.
Yeah, so the power expression that I showed.
Yeah. So we just break it up in parallel and perpendicular with that.
Yes.
And then do individual transform.
Right. But the point is that an observer, which is in a different frame, almost never sees the total power that the particle emits. The observer will see the radiation that the observer intercepts. And that's different because in the rest frame of the particle, the radiation has a certain pattern. So it a certain pattern which covers a large range of angles. Now, which means that the radiation is being directed in different directions from the radiating particle, and they will, in the universe, they'll intercept different observers. So we will only see a certain part of the radiation that the particle emits, and that part is not Lorentz invariant. That's got a huge dependence on the relative velocity of the particle and the observer. So when you're trying to look at the actual observed power of from the particle, you will have to take care of the Lorentz transformations. And this is two special cases mentioned here, but in general there will be a combination of acceleration parallel to the velocity and acceleration perpendicular to the velocity.
This is for a point radiator.
Yeah, we're talking about particles. Yes, for point radiators. For if it is an extended radiator, then you have to sum it over all the points which are radiated. So you can integrate over the radiating volume. So for a point radiator, you will have an acceleration which you can decompose into parallel and perpendicular component of the velocity, and then you can later combine the results depending on the proportion of this. So in the rest frame of the particle, you have E square by 4 pi c cube, a parallel prime square. Prime quantities are in the instantaneous rest frame of the particle. So here that has been transformed out. So it's been written in terms of the A parallel as seen by the observer. So this right hand side is entirely in terms of quantities defined in the observer's frame. Theta is the angle between the velocity of the particle and the line of sight. So, and what you would notice is this factor, which is 1 minus beta mu to the power of 6 here. Beta is the velocity in units of speed of light, and mu is cos theta. Okay. So, and if you take the perpendicular component, it is similar, but the expression is different because of Lorentz transformation.
Phi is what?
Yeah, so these are two angles, azimuthal angles. So it's theta and phi. So with respect to the so you have two things. One is the velocity of the particle, and other is the direction of radiation that is emitted by the particle, and the observer's own coordinate frame. So in principle, you will have two angles in the observer's coordinate frame. You will have theta and phi, which will determine the direction of the photon propagation in the observer's field.
No, this is when the observer is actually observing the radiation, right?
Yeah.
So when the observer is observing the radiation, and then the direction of the radiation as well as the direction of line of sight, they will be same, right?
Yeah, that is correct. So in the observer's frame, you can have multiple observers, right? We are talking about two frames. One frame is moving with respect to another frame. So let's take a frame where there is an observer, right? So that in the frame of the observer, you can have multiple observers moving at the same velocity with respect to the particle, but located at different points. So that is how you get theta and phi. So this is important when you talk about, let's say, a pulsar which is radiating and it is rotating with respect to you. So then you are sampling different values of phi. So you are observing the same frame, but then the azimuthal angle changes. So the factor here is 1 minus beta mu to the 4, and then 1 minus beta mu square comes from here. So typically you have a large factor which is 1 minus beta mu to the power of some large power, 4, 6, and then depending on the actual value of gamma, you can make expansions of this. If the gamma is very large, you can just expand this, and then you can take a look at the final dependence on gamma. But if you just take this 1 minus beta mu, 1 by 1 minus beta mu, just take a look at the shape of that function. So this is theta in radians in respect to theta equal to 0. So I've plotted here plus or minus 1 radian, and you can see that just 1 minus beta equal to minus 1 this is already a very strongly peaked function. So when you raise it to larger and larger powers, this will get more and more peaked, and that is how you get very strong beaming. And this is for gamma equal to 100. The typical half power width here is at 1 by gamma. So that's why people say that radiation is beam within a small 1 by gamma angle. So it's not that the radiation is not there at other angles, but the intensity falls rapidly as you go away from that.
Theta is the angle between particle velocity and line of sight, right?
That is correct. Particle velocity and the radiation, basically. Yes, that's correct.
Radius. And
Yeah.
phi is the angle between.
Phi is if the okay. So you have. So you see here we're talking about acceleration perpendicular to velocity. So the acceleration provides one axis, velocity provides another axis. If you take these two as your primary axis, with respect to this, where the observer is, that can be defined by two angles, theta and phi. Because in this case there is only one defining axis, which is the velocity. Here there are two defining axes, velocity and acceleration, and take those two as your basis, and then observer can be anywhere with respect to that. So that for that you will get two angles, theta and phi.
Phi is basically acceleration and line of sight to the observer.
I'm not sure.
No. Yeah, you could probably say that. It depends on the way you define.
Now,
phi.
means it's a unique one single value
It
of
depends
phi.
on this or that.
Yes.
You have to see.
I
So-
thought actually it was like r theta phi coordinates.
It is r theta phi coordinate.
That phi I think is this one.
Yeah, so that r theta phi coordinate must have a basis.
Yeah.
So the two basis vectors are velocity and acceleration. So if there is one basis vector is acceleration, then you can define phi with respect to that in the plane containing the
Velocity and
Observers.
yeah. So you, okay. Then there are a few other things which we need to remember, and some of the things, the transformation of it, you can derive from Lorentz invariance. So some quantities are Lorentz invariant. So then, using that, if you know one of the quantities, you can derive the transformation of the other quantities. And starting with, for example, specific intensity. We have not introduced specific intensity yet, but I'm sure you know that we are talking about radiation going into different directions, different solid angles. So if you take intensity, specific intensity defined as energy crossing per unit area, per unit time, per unit frequency band, per unit solid angle. That is specific intensity, right? And this you can define in any frame, whether it's a radiator frame or in the observer frame. And the quantity is specific intensity transforms like this. So that I nu over nu cubed is constant. So if you go from one frame to another, you know how frequency transform, because you know
Lorentz transformation.
the Lorentz transformation of frequency. So you can then apply that to get the new specific intensity by applying this Lorentz invariant relation that I nu by nu cubed is very constant. And this is one of the very useful relations in radiative transfer that people use. Now, in the source function, in the radiative transfer equation, source function appears at the same status as the specific intensity. So, I nu by nu cube being constant will also mean that source function S nu by nu cube is constant.
So if in any case, when people want to do this, when they try to simulate them, so first they calculate so for this transfer, people will be interested in looking at what is the intensity coming from the source.
Right.
So they can directly do the same thing in the rest frame of the source and then take I nu by nu cube over there, and they can directly code that is what even the observer will also observe, right?
Yes. I nu by nu cube is
I nu by
constant.
nu cube, what they
Yes,
will
I nu by nu cube is invariant. So, except the nu will be different in the observer.
Exactly. So just only
So-
that extra transformation one need to do to transform to get back the intensity.
Yes, that's correct. So this is
if nu will be different, then I nu will also be different.
that is correct.
But the ratio will be
Ratio I nu by nu cube will remain constant. So you will transform nu from one frame to another, right? So let's say you're at rest frame you're radiating at 10 keV, and in the observer frame that becomes 1 MeV, right? So the I nu at 10 keV will now be transformed to I nu at 1 MeV by this relation, right?
So it's basically I nu by nu cube source equals to I nu by nu cube observer. Just I have to just
Yes. Then in radiative transfer equation you have these other intrinsic quantities called the emission coefficient and absorption coefficient, and they transform like this. Emission coefficient is J nu by nu squared is a Lorentz invariant, and absorption coefficient alpha nu times nu is Lorentz invariant. So as you can see, source function is J nu by alpha nu, and you get S nu by nu cubed, also as Lorentz invariant. Optical depth tau, if you define in any frame, that is a Lorentz invariant. Why is that?
it is an optical path length, right?
All lengths change, right? All lengths.
optical index means I think we have to multiply with something like refractive index.
No, it is alpha nu ds, integral of alpha nu ds,
Yes.
right? That's the definition of optical depth. But what does optical depth really tell us? Where is it used?
This is the idea of mean free path from travel.
Yes. So if you have an optical depth tau of a certain region, then e to the power of minus tau gives you the ratio of the number of photons that exit to number of photons that are incident.
The number remains constant.
The
Did not get the point. I mean, what does it? Number of photons.
so suppose there is certain number of photons incident and certain number of photons exit the system. That ratio is given by e to the power of minus tau, right? And this number ratio cannot change. If you look at it from another frame, even if this is moving,
So tau has to be constant.
yeah, so that has to be constant. So the tau has to be constant by definition. So tau is Lorentz invariant by definition.
It sort of depends the transfer function of the medium.
No, when you talk about a medium, there are various quantities you can use to characterize that medium. That includes its absorption coefficient, emission coefficient, and so on. And optical depth is one effective number that you can put for a certain piece of the medium. And that is something that remains Lorentz invariant. But these emission coefficient and absorption coefficient have their own transformation relation when you go from one frame to another. Aberration is something that also will occur when you want to look at the emission from one frame to another, and that is given by This is transformation of angles. So suppose in one frame you have, with respect to x, an angle theta defined. And let's say the relative velocity is in the x direction. So you have another frame moving with velocity beta, Lorentz factor gamma with respect to this frame. Then the same angle. So let's say in the prime frame, a photon is emitted at an angle theta prime with respect to the velocity axis. In the observer's frame, or in the other frame which is moving at Lorentz factor gamma, that same emission is seen to take place at an angle theta. And these two are connected this way. Tan theta is sine theta prime by 1 plus cos theta prime plus beta, and cos theta is cos theta prime plus beta divided by 1 minus 1 plus beta cos theta prime. If you know theta prime, you can get theta. And here again, you will find, so let's take cos theta prime, or let's take theta prime equal to pi by 2. Then what is the result that you get? Theta prime is pi by 2, cos theta is 0. And cos theta prime is 0, right? So cos theta is equal to beta. So what is the theta then?
Cos inverse d by c.
Yeah, so can you relate it to something else? Cos theta is beta. So expand both sides. 1 minus theta squared by 2.
Cos theta equals to beta.
Yeah.
And then
So this is so
What will be 1 hour gap?
yeah, we'll come out to 1 hour.
oh, you're saying that.
So
You're saying to do 1 minus beta square root.
yeah. So you take the so anyway, once you do that algebra, you will find that this becomes 1 by gamma. So here again, you can say tan theta, this is 1, this is 0. So you get tan theta is 1 by gamma beta. Right? So beta is close to 1 anyway.
So
tan
what that refers to?
Hmm?
That question again written. I mean, if theta equal to 1 by gamma.
Theta prime, yeah, theta prime is pi by 2.
Yeah.
Then theta will become nearly 1 by gamma. Because here you can see that you put theta prime equal to pi by 2, this becomes 1, this becomes 0. So tan theta is 1 by gamma beta.
Gamma.
And if gamma is large, beta is close to 1.
Yeah.
So you'll get tan theta is equal to 1 by gamma, so therefore theta is roughly equal to 1 by gamma. So what this means is entire forward hemisphere is seen to be squeezed within 1 by gamma. Okay. So backward hemisphere then gets spread over the rest of the angles.
I didn't get
The range 0 to pi by 2 in theta prime, you can check that the 0 goes to 0. You sign,
0 is going to
0 goes to 0.
Yes.
Pi by 2 goes to 1 by gamma.
Oh, so it gets shrinked in one direction towards
So the
B. case of pulsar magnetosphere, shift in phase that you see of the radiation when you receive it. Particularly if the particle is moving in a toroidal fashion, then the aberration will lead to, so in the frame of the particle, the emission may have taken at one phase, but in observer frame, you see that
emission is shifted in angle, so you will receive that emission in a different phase. So aberration, particularly for radiation from close to light cylinder, will result in shifting of phase.
How can then, so suppose when we do the pulse profile, we get the information about the phase, but that is what the phase in the
That's the phase in the observer's phase.
observer sphere.
That is correct.
Now,
If you want to map it back to the rotational space, spin phase
Yes.
of the object,
Yes.
then you have to go through this aberration correction.
yes, so we have to do this reverse way. We
Yeah.
know now theta, and we have to get back the theta prime. Now, what this theta prime can tell us about now this theta prime can also tell us about the geometry of the magnetic field. If we assume that it is the emission is all coming along very tightly bound to this magnetic field lines, right?
Yes, it will tell you, but you have to do this aberration correction, and this is done routinely. But for example, in trying to get fiducial points in fiducial reference points for rotating vector model, you have to
You have
do
to
the aberration
correct
correction.
for
Yeah.
this aberration.
Yeah.
From the pulse profile, first you have to go back, correct it, and then put it back into the RDF.
Correct. Right. So there's a lot of work in the late 80s, early 90s, which developed this connection and aberration corrections and so on. Blaskowicz, Wolzan, and various others. Blaskowicz.
BLAS.
Skiewiecz. So,
Russian.
huh?
Is it Russian?
Polish.
Polish.
So, but there are various others also. So you can take a look at late 80s, early 90s literature. So, or even if you take a look at the work that Gangadhara does.
Ah.
So he also takes care of all these transformations and. Okay. Okay. Next, very important thing in pulsar radiation is polarization. Invariably, in whatever wavelengths we can see and measure polarization, pulsar radiation is seen to be highly polarized. We know in radio, we have seen pulsars which are at times even 100% linearly polarized. At other times, the polarization fraction may be less, but it could be mixture of multiple modes. When you mode separate, then the polarization degree goes up, and there is some degree of circular polarization as well. So, in general, the pulsar radiation in radio is really strongly polarized. At higher energies, it is not so easy to measure polarization because pulsars are faint emitters, and polarimetry requires a lot of photons. But it has been done basically only for crab pulsars at very high energies. In optical band, crab pulsar is again quite strongly polarized. And at the highest energies at which we have been able to measure polarization, for example, AstroSat has measured the highest energies, polarization at the highest energy so far. And there we see 33% polarization of the crab pulsar, even at 400 keV. Right? So you have a strong polarization all across the band. So how does this polarization arise? And this is intrinsic to the emission mechanism, of course. And just the emission mechanism alone is not enough to ensure that you will have strong polarization. Also, geometrical factors in the magnetosphere are essential to determine what kind of polarization you will see. So, going back to basic emission mechanism and what kind of polarization you can expect, you can take synchrotron radiation, as we talked about before, and you have the radiating particle, let us say, gyrating and in a spiral form in the magnetic field. So the net polarization from these particles can be split up into this parallel and perpendicular component with respect to the magnetic field, and the polarization degree is defined as this ratio, P perpendicular minus P parallel, P perpendicular plus P parallel, and this the perpendicular component always dominates. So perpendicular component is perpendicular to the projected magnetic field in the sky. So that always dominates.
So when we are looking at the pulsar, so it's, as the beam is pointing toward us, so basically we are seeing that the magnetic field is basically going, it's kind of diverging from a single point like outward, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now when we look from the plane of sky, so and it's rotating, so then we can define, actually this is what we can define x and y coordinate in this plane, and
yeah, wherever there is a magnetic field, you can always define a direction. We project the magnetic field in the plane of the sky. You define a direction which is parallel to that projection and one which is perpendicular to the projection. And if synchrotron radiation is your main emission mechanism, then the polarization perpendicular to the projected magnetic field dominates.
but that is in that plane only, right?
Which plane?
In the plane where I have projected.
Yeah, so that is basically perpendicular to your line of sight. So that is
that is perpendicular to my line of sight.
Yes, in that plane you project the magnetic field, and the polarization will be perpendicular to that projection.
Polarization is perpendicular to that, so it's along the.
No, it can't be along the line.
Sorry. It is in vertical.
Yes,
vertical.
it's a transverse electromagnetic wave.
Yeah.
So that direction dominates. This is the line of sight, and this is the direction that dominates. And when you have multiple particles, this p parallel component can cancel between multiple particles, and this adds. So you will have the net polarization mainly along the normal to the projected magnetic field in synchrotron radiation.
Why the p parallel and not p perpendicular?
Sorry?
Why only p parallel is getting cancelled? But see, it's always same plane, right? So I can think of this vector can rotate, right, in that plane. Now over one cycle, if
yeah,
they
so you
are
can
parallel,
have one particle going this way, the other particle going
opposite
down
direction.
Opposite direction.
Yes.
In those two cases, the p perpendicular will be in the same direction, but p parallel will be in the opposite direction. So you will.
How?
What do you mean how?
If one of them is going down,
Yeah.
Why their p perpendicular is the same direction?
P perpendicular will be in the same direction, in the
Same kind of charge.
for the same charge. Yeah. If the charge changes, then it will. If you change the sign of the charge, then it will become opposite.
By that
Because the acceleration E v cross b.
Oh, that decides the orientation of motion.
That is right.
With that argument, then if there is electron positron.
So if you have an equal mixture of electron positron pairs with exactly the same
Then there should be zero.
exactly the same Lorentz factor distribution, then the net polarization is zero. Net polarization will be zero. So the only way you will get residual polarization is if the Lorentz factor distribution of these two species are not the same.
But how is it possible? Because they have the same mass, right?
But not in an electric field, they're accelerated differently.
Differently, that is also. Yeah.
So in pulsar magnetosphere, this is the primary input. You have electron distribution, you have a positron distribution, the Lorentz factor distributions are different. That is the primary input to pulsar radiation. Okay? So, going a little further, so you have this gyrating particle, you can, and you know the radiation is strongly beamed. So, because of the gyration, that the beam is actually going to execute a motion and cover this part of the solid angle, where this width is 1 over gamma. So as the particle goes round, the beam will just cover this part. And so this is pitch angle alpha, and this is theta, which goes from 0 to 1 over gamma. And as a function of this, you can then compute the electric field and then look at the intensity. So this now this is plotted as a function of frequency. X is omega by the critical frequency. Sorry, a little bit faint. So here is the perpendicular component of the polarization or intensity. Here is the parallel component of the intensity. So you can see that there is a difference by at least an order of magnitude. And when you have radiation coming from multiple particles with different energies, largely what you see is the radiation dominating near the maximum for each particle, and you add up the radiation from near the maximum for each particle, and that's how you get the total spectrum. So near the maximum, as you can see, that this difference is more than an order of magnitude. And then when you look at the polarization, you, as a function of this frequency, so that is this minus this divided by this plus this, you get something rising. Around the maximum, it is nearly about 70 to 80%.
What is that X? X.
X is this.
Frequency.
X is frequency in units of the critical frequency. Okay, so since the emission from near the maximum is most important, you have a typical contribution to polarization from these synchrotron emitting particles, which lie in the range about 60 to 80%, about 70% on an average. But then, depending on the energy distribution of particles, you will average it differently. And that can change the net degree of polarization.
That can reduce over here.
Yeah, it will reduce it can reduce a bit.
Yeah.
But the amount of reduction will depend on the spectral index. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. If you have particle energy distribution n gamma proportional to gamma to the minus p, then you know that the spectrum will have this slope, minus p minus 1 by 2. And that simply comes from the fact that the peak synchrotron frequency has a dependence on gamma, has a dependence of gamma squared, and synchrotron power also has a dependence of gamma squared. From this alone, you can derive the slope of the spectrum. Now, this is the optically thin part. J nu goes as this e to the power minus p minus 1 by 2. But every process has its inverse. The synchrotron emission process has an inverse, which is self-absorption. For that, if you calculate the absorption coefficient, it goes as e to the power minus p plus 4 by 2. So it rises very steeply at low frequencies. So that's low enough frequency, this will start dominating. So optical depth alpha nu L will become large. In that case, you will then see emission which is proportional to the source function, which is e to the power 5 halves. Okay, so there are certain caveats to it, which I'll come to in a moment. But with the pure synchrotron emission going from 0 frequency to the infinite frequency, at some point, if it starts becoming optically thick, below that frequency, you will have the synchrotron spectrum breaking from here and then going down with the shape of e to the power 5 halves. Okay. Now, what do we actually see? So there we have to bring in other possibilities. The fact that the intrinsic spectrum, the energy distribution of the electrons, is not going from 0 to infinity. there will be a minimum energy, there will be a maximum energy. Now, if there is a minimum energy, if the material is still optically thin at that point, so let's say at minimum energy of the electron, you have the corresponding new synchrotron at some frequency. Below that energy, there are no particles. Okay, because that's the minimum energy of the particle distribution. So then, below that energy, what you will see is just this part of the distribution, which is nu to the power of 1/3. So you will get this nu to the power of 1/3 spectrum below that. Now, if it is optically thin at this point, but as it keeps going down, at some point it becomes optically thick. Then, below that, you will have the standard optically thick spectrum, and it will follow the Rayleigh-Jeans law, which is nu to the plus 2, not nu to the plus 2.5. Whereas if it became optically thick here, you will have the non-thermal synchrotron self-absorption, which will have a slope of nu to the plus 2.5.
I could not understand this point. So, in the Rayleigh-Jeans limit, so it goes as nu to the power 2, so
Yeah.
it is 2.5, so it is this extra factor of 0.5 coming.
Yes. So, Rayleigh-Jeans, where does the Rayleigh-Jeans expression come from? It is 2 nu squared, something called kT by c squared. KT is a relevant quantity only for thermal distribution of emitters, right? This is not a thermal distribution of emitters.
So that
Right?
comes with temperature.
Correct. So there is no temperature that you can define here,
Okay.
right? So instead of kT, what you have is a characteristic energy. A characteristic energy of particles which are producing the radiation at the energy at the frequency that you see. Okay. So now, if you have a particle energy distribution which truncates at a certain energy, all emission below that energy is basically a product of particles at that energy, because they are the largest in number and they are also the closest to the in frequency to us. Okay.
Come again. So if you have a collection of particles
With different energies, with dropping spectrum.
the dropping spectrum.
So now, if the synchrotron frequency corresponding to the minimum energy of the distribution is located here,
Okay.
and you are looking at a frequency of emission which is much lower than that, then the characteristic energy of particles which are responsible for emission at that lower frequency is actually the lowest energy particles here.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So the characteristic energy of the particle, which is responsible for emitting at the frequency that you are looking at, is basically fixed at energies below, at frequencies below this. So 2 nu squared kT by c squared. The kT I am going to replace by characteristic energy. Okay, let's say E. E particle, right? So that E particle is the same for all the frequencies below.
Okay.
Right? So you get nu squared factor.
Okay.
Now look at this. Here, if you look at this energy, the emission at that energy comes from particles of a certain energy for which the synchrotron peak is at this energy. If you go to that energy, the emission comes from a different set of particles for which the synchrotron peak is at that energy.
Okay.
Correct? And that is true on this branch as well.
Okay.
Right?
I mean this part, this middle part.
This middle part.
No, that one.
This one.
Oh, so
Yeah.
this line is actually an envelope of different particles having peaks
Peak
at
energy.
different energies.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So basically,
That is true for this as well.
Like this.
Okay.
These are this P minus 1 by 2 is just an envelope of emissions from different particles at different energies.
Okay.
Right?
I mean,
So
I
these
mean-
envelopes get added here as well.
I mean peak values, right?
Hmm?
That is for the peak synchrotron energy. Particles, certain particle that is emitting at that frequency for which the energy is at its peak. Synchrotron energy.
No. For a given energy, there is a synchrotron
Frequency.
intensity that is at peak value.
Okay, synchrotron intensity.
is at peak value. So this is for a single particle, right? The synchrotron intensity for this peaks at this frequency, right? So corresponding to each frequency, you can then find a particle for which the peak frequency lies at the frequency of observation, right? So that's what is happening here. If you have a particle of lower energy, after the peak frequency, the emission drops dramatically. So that doesn't contribute here. If you take particle of a higher energy, those are much fewer in number because of the slope. So they don't contribute here. So therefore, the only particles that contribute dominantly are those for which the synchrotron peak energy lies at the observation frequency. Right? So that then can be tracked along this. And now, here what is happening is the same thing is occurring. The emission at this frequency is not related to the same energy particle as emission at that frequency. And how does the particle energy change with the frequency? You know that nu synchrotron is proportional to gamma square, which is energy square. Right? So if I want to work back, gamma is proportional to nu synchrotron to the power of half. Right? So you have nu squared, 2 nu squared, E characteristic by C squared. Now that E characteristic goes as nu to the power of half. Right? So you get nu to the power of 2.5. So that's the reason why you get
even
this.
for non-thermal distribution of energy, you can define a characteristic energy, which is where kT is replaced by that characteristic energy, and now this characteristic energy has a dependence on frequency, which goes as 1 by 2.
That is correct.
So 2 here, half here, gives you 2.5.
That is correct. So that's the reason why you get these 2 points.
So there is another question that I had. So how do you know where will a medium get optically thick?
So for that you have to calculate this. You have to calculate the absorption frequency. Absorption coefficient,
Okay.
and then have some knowledge about the number density distribution and the size of the system and so on.
Okay.
Right? So then you'll be able to just integral of alpha nu ds is your optical depth. You calculate that. When optical depth is larger than 1, you can call it optically thick. Right? Usually you will do the reverse. If you find a synchrotron self-absorption frequency, then you say, okay, that now gives me the size. Because a priori it is difficult to decide what is the size of the observing region. But if you do see this, then you can determine based on other parameters here. I have only shown you the proportionality, but it's got factors in front which depend on the magnetic field, which depend on other local quantities. Right? So those can be determined based on the spectrum here and the intensity here. And some of those factors are responsible for this as well. So when you combine both of these, then you can solve for more parameters of the system.
And there is one other thing which is not really. So when you say something on the power law, you said something on the acceleration process itself. Like this.
I did not talk about how does this power law distribution of energy get established.
Yeah.
Right? There are multiple mechanisms for that to happen. But more I'll say that more commonly invoked mechanism is Fermi acceleration of some kind or other.
What?
Fermi acceleration of some kind or other.
Oh, Fermi.
Right? It could be Fermi acceleration of first order or second order, or what is called diffusive shock acceleration, DSA. That is a variant of the Fermi acceleration.
Okay.
So you could have a mixture of both first and second order as well. So now Fermi acceleration is notionally just a umbrella term for mechanism. The actual realization of it as to how you scatter particles and so on, that is a detail that can change from system to system. But overall, as long as you have scattering of particles, which can make the particle move back and forth in acceleration region, then in general this mechanism will operate and produce a power law distribution. It only requires that there is a kinetic energy reservoir which you are tapping, and there is a relative velocity between the particles that are getting accelerated and the kinetic energy reservoir that you are tapping. Right? Once you have that, and as long as the tapping of this is through point scatterings, then power law generation is inevitable.
In case of pulsar, what is that kinetic energy reservoir?
Yeah, in case of pulsar, it comes from the electric field. So the particles are being accelerated in an electric field. Power law distribution gets established because of pair cascade. So you get larger number of pairs at lower energy than at higher energy, because the first generation pairs that you generate are the highest energy. They then radiate and then they produce more photons, and those photons create larger number of pairs at somewhat lower energy. And the next generation creates even larger number of pairs at somewhat lower energy. And when that adds up, you get a power law distribution. So it's like an avalanche process.
So in case of pulsar magnetosphere, it is an avalanche process which gives rise to this power law distribution.
That is correct.
Now there is no acceleration mechanism in case of pulsar. I mean, I just want.
No, the electric field is the acceleration mechanism.
In the vacuum gap,
Without the electric field, none of this will happen.
No. Acceleration means I'm talking about the kind of Fermi's acceleration we are talking about.
No, we are not talking about Fermi acceleration normally in pulsar magnetospheres. So Fermi acceleration, what it does is to take low energy particles and raise them to higher energies. In pulsar magnetosphere, typically what is happening is initially the particles are raised to very high energies by electric field, and from there you are just going down in energy, establishing the power law, rather than going up in energy and establishing the power law. Because here the number of particles are changing. When you're talking about typical Fermi acceleration, the number of particles is not changing. The same number of particles, you keep on moving them to higher and higher energies. So as you start from lower energy, some particles get to a certain energy. A smaller fraction gets to somewhat higher energy. Even smaller fraction gets to higher energy. So that way you may establish this power. In pulsar magnetosphere, it is happening the other way. First, you pull out particles or inject particles in some manner, and with very strong electric field, you accelerate them to highest energy. But once you do that, then those particles radiate, and then produce a larger number of particles at lower energy, which then again radiate and produce even larger number of particles at lower energy. So number of particles here is not conserved. Each subsequent generation has lower and lower energy and larger and larger number. So you establish a power law again with larger number of particles at lower energy.
yeah, I had another question. So there's also low frequency cutoff. So why should this cutoff be there?
No, this, sorry. You mean this one?
Yeah.
No, this is the same as the synchronous self-absorption. It could be either here or there. It cannot be in both places in the same system.
No, I was talking about the low frequency cutoff. There's a cutoff in frequency. So beyond that, there's no intensity.
No, I haven't plotted any such thing. This is log scale.
Oh,
So it will, 0 is at minus infinity here. Yeah? If it is not log scale, you will not get this straight line segments for a power law spectrum. So it's always plotted at log scale. Okay, so now I think I'll have to stop here today. So you have polarization. So as I said, depending on the power law index, you're now going to do the averaging differently, and you'll get somewhat different value of polarization. And the typical values of power law index that we encounter in astronomy is somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5, and that gives you a net polarization of about 70% or so on an average, 65 to 75%. As you saw, for individual particles, you could get up to 80%, but when you average, it will of course come down. And if the polar index is large, then you get a larger amount of polarization. If polar index is small, you get a smaller amount of polarization. Why? Because if the polar index is small, then at a given energy, you have more contribution from a larger range of energies of particles.
Repeat once again.
At a given frequency, you have contribution from particles over a larger energy range if the energy distribution, injected energy distribution is flatter.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So then you are averaging over particles with different synchrotron peaks, and therefore averaging over radiation with different degrees of polarization. So the net polarization comes down further. If it is very steep, then basically particle only very close to that synchrotron peak only contributes. So you go closer and closer to that 80% result.
So now, just by looking at the polarization fraction for any kind of emission what we are seeing, we can then go and trace back well up to by saying that whether the emission mechanism itself is different from one to other, right?
No, polarization certainly is a good discriminator between emission mechanisms. If you can measure polarization as well as spectrum, then you can always do this sanity check whether the polarization as well as spectrum match the prediction from a given emission mechanism, provided you are seeing the emission as emitted. But that is hardly ever the case, because there will be processes while the radiation propagates which can change polarization. You can get parallel rotation, you can get depolarization due to thermal medium in between. So you have to remove all those effects and then ask whether you are seeing the effect of the basic emission mechanism in that.
So with only the spectrum measure, can one tell anything about the emission mechanism?
In a limited way, but you will not be able to fix the emission mechanism just from a spectrum, because very similar spectrum you will also get out of non-thermal Compton, for example. Right? So, and as I will come to, the curvature radiation will also give you the same spectrum. Right? So that alone will not tell you. But if you see that the polarization that you are finding is primarily parallel to the projected magnetic field and not perpendicular, then you will favor curvature emission over synchrotron emission. Right? So polarization is a good discriminator. Okay. So